Welcome back to Real Talk with Susan Stone and Kristina Supler. We are full-time moms and attorneys bringing our student defense legal practice to life with real, candid conversations.
So, Kristina, we have a really bizarre practice.
Why is that?
I'm going to tell you. Because we don't do just one thing. You can't put us in a box. It's like that line from Dirty Dancing, nobody puts baby in a corner. When I think about what we deal with on a given day, we're everywhere.
Well, and I think that just like you can't put our practice in a box, you really can't put our clients in a box either, because we're dealing with so many different types of legal issues and people all over the country, students with problems that they want help with.
Yeah, and I've noticed that starting a couple years ago, our first sadly wrongful death case came to us, and then we started working in a couple personal injury cases, and that's forced us to grow into an area that I would have never identified as.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. I mean, we're so passionate about getting the best result possible for our clients. We team up with so many different professionals all over the country.
What's interesting about our client or our podcast today is that we're actually having someone that we worked with on a case and hope to work with in the future. And a lot of people would be like, why are you putting another lawyer on your podcast? I mean, aren't you worried about drawing business away from yourself? I mean, that's the question.
Yeah, and I think that the answer is no. We're not afraid of that. We are passionate about what we do, and we want to get, again, the best result possible. So we're really pleased to be joined today by Brian Kent. Brian is a nationally recognized advocate for victims' rights. Brian has dedicated his career to seeking justice for survivors of abuse, assault, and exploitation. As a former sex crimes prosecutor in Philadelphia, Brian's an advocate for justice for all crime victims. He's handled many high-profile cases, including representing survivors of Jerry Sandusky, boarding school abuse, and also clergy abuse. And as Susan alluded to, not too long ago, we paired up with Brian on a really interesting case and resolved it quite favorably. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks. So great.
Yeah. And it was great working with you. And I think what made the case it was more enjoyable to work on together is that we sort of saw the case from our lens of what we do representing students involved in disciplinary processes at school. And the team you gave us, we worked a lot with your colleague, Mike, saw it from a personal injury perspective. Is that typical for you to pair with other lawyers?
Yeah, I think our practice, since day one, given our specialization in these types of cases, we would get a lot of calls from folks around the country to come in and help with either sexual abuse, assault, or trafficking case. And I think given our background of most of us, if not all of us on the crime victim team being former prosecutors, there's oftentimes, as you both know, an ongoing criminal case. And that's an important aspect of sort of healing for the survivors in these cases, and being able to have a former prosecutor who knows the ins and outs of that process, can talk to the detective or the DA, and then also handle the civil case was something unique, and I think continues to be unique for our client. I'd say the large majority of our cases are cases where we have been asked to come in like a co-counsel situation like we all had and help out, or us getting a case in say, Ohio and calling you and saying, hey, let's team up. I think, and I get a lot of enjoyment from those relationships as well. And I learn a lot too. Our practice is really built on that sort of bedrock though.
Brian, I'd like to talk for a moment about something personal. When Susan and I were reading about your background and preparing to talk with you a bit today, we read that you are a survivor of sexual abuse. So can you tell us how that has led to your work today?
Yeah, sure. So I went to Catholic grade school and Catholic high school in the Philadelphia area, was an altar boy. We had a abusive priest that came in, was head of the altar boys when I was in 4th and 5th grade, and then was shipped out 2 years later. Why, we don't know yet, but hopefully someday will. And he had abused me multiple times in the church area or in our church and school, kind of like together, and in the rectory area. And I would say, I talk about like, I would say subconsciously probably directed my career, but I was never like definitively like, this is what I'm going to do. But when I went to the DA's office, I started prosecuting sex crimes and specifically child sexual abuse cases. And throughout my career, I think it's helped me tremendously, not just from a standpoint of being able to communicate with my clients and like truly understand how difficult it is, not just to say, hey, I'm going to file a lawsuit, but just to talk to anybody about it. I mean, I still have difficulty talking about it. And it took me a very long time to even talk about it in the first place. So having that connection with survivors that come in to talk to me about their cases, I think is incredibly important for them. It's also important for me that they know, that I truly do understand somewhat of what they have gone through and what they're going through. And I also think like from a perspective of trying cases and conveying to a jury the impact on someone, it gives me a unique perspective and I think voice to really help people understand how many different ways this impacts an individual to make sure that the jury, when they're making their decision, adequately has a full sort of backdrop of every single aspect that this goes into somebody's life, whether that means as a child growing up, your relationship with your parents, your job, your ability to trust other people, your marriage, ultimately when you have kids, addiction issues, things of that nature. I mean, there's just so many different realms that it can go into. And I think it really helps that I have personal experience in that regard. So I've tried to use something as horrific as that as sort of a positive aspect in my life and just recognize that it put me on a journey to where I'm at today. And as not a day I probably don't go by that I don't think about it, but I also just try to use it the best way that I can use it.
I just listened to a podcast this weekend. As a podcaster, I love to poke and see what other people are doing. And it was on a topic that I struggle with, which is, what is my purpose? Because maybe it's a middle age, and I'm sure it's a middle age thing, but I think it's something I've wrestled with my whole life. That why am I on this earth? It just can't be to walk through the day, get up, go to work, make dinner, raise my kids. Not that those aren't incredibly important aspects of my life, but I'd like to think that we all are on this earth for some really important reason. And in this podcast that I listened to, the guest said something, and it was my aha moment. The guest said that we go through trauma and that the ultimate way to find your purpose is to use that trauma as a way to serve others. Because everybody goes through some sort of trauma. Everybody is in pain. And if you can take what you do and be a balm to somebody else, then it's not for nothing that you went through that experience. And I was thinking about my own life story, and I've had a lot of traumatic moments, and I know it's what makes me fight for clients, because I wanted to feel when I was down and out, the people who were most important to me were those who weren't going to stay neutral, but would stand up and fight. And it's my gift and my curse, because sometimes I fight too hard and I don't listen.
And I think it's interesting to think about, it's interesting that you bring up this idea of trauma and purpose, and we're talking about it in the context of lawyers on a podcast. But I think that it's so important to think about how a job isn't necessarily the ends and means of the whole end of your purpose, but a vehicle that allows you to achieve that. And I think what I'm hearing a common theme among the three of us is that we really enjoy what we do, and it helps us look to the greater good we can do.
There are a lot of calls about emotional distress damages. And we had a blow recently with the law in terms of Title IX cases, which is the bulk of what we do. You cannot recover emotional distress damages for a Title IX action. However, you recover emotional distress, and we'd love your insight because people are like, I'm so upset. Do they have to go to therapy? And if sending someone to therapy contrived, and does there need to be a physical injury attached? Help talk about emotional distress because I must talk about it once a week. What about you, Kristina?
Well, and everyone we speak to has really suffered and experienced a trauma that is impacting their lives in very real ways. And it's hard to say that as a lawyer, oh, sorry, the law is not going to recognize that here, but maybe there are other contexts. So, Brian, what are your thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, so it's funny because the way that I present call them emotional distress injuries to a jury is, and it's true, is that it's a brain injury and it is a physical injury. It's a brain injury that has happened as a result of trauma. You have a brain injury where somebody hits their head really hard against a car window if they're hit. This is just a different type of brain injury, but doesn't mean it's not as devastating as that scenario. And I really get into the neurobiology of the trauma. So what area of the brain is it affecting and how is it manifesting it as a result of that change? And I think we have seen a huge progression over the past couple of years in terms of being able to measure this. I mean, there are, some studies that have been done to show what happens to the brain when there is abuse and neglect at a young age, and how can you physically see that on something like, a CT scan or CAT scan or something like that. And you physically can see changes in the brain, not all the time, but there are cells in the brain that change and areas of the brain that there may be deficits as a result of the actual trauma that's occurred, especially if it's over a significant period of time, that a jury can look at and say, oh my gosh, yeah, clearly there's been this trauma that's affected the brain. We started through organization that I'm involved in, Child USA, we started doing judicial education of educating the judges on emotional distress and harm and things of that nature. And when I bring this up and give this presentation on the neurobiology of trauma, and you just see their eyes light up and they're like, oh my gosh, and why people are acting the way that they're acting and things of that nature. It just puts it in a different perspective for juries and for people that really don't understand the inside part of what's happening to somebody, as opposed to just the outside manifestation of what the injury is. But it's what it is. I always say the outside is the symptomology. The inside is really the injury. And being able to show that to a jury from a physical standpoint is super important for them to understanding that. And being able to appreciate the harm, the level of harm that the trauma caused. I know this Cummings decision has been, to say detrimental would be the understatement of the year. But I also think that, I think you're going to see a progression from this emotional distress and really trying to show that this is a physical injury such that, it may not be limited by this decision, and hopefully utilize what I'm talking about in terms of neurobiology of trauma to make that happen. With this Supreme Court, it may be a lost cause, but I think that's just one way I think we're going to start seeing people trying to get around that.
It's fascinating. Neurobiology of trauma is a phrase that we hear in different contexts, and it's interesting. It's confusing in some respects, but let's roll it back to just basics. We have many of our audience members are parents, and for parents who are listening, if they have a student on campus at school away from home who's injured for whatever reason, maybe in a dorm room, is assaulted by another student, a sexual assault perhaps, what are some basic steps that you would encourage a student to take to start to document their injuries or think about, what to do next?
We've done a lot of work educating parents ourselves, and on our website, it's Defense at KJA, we have a lot of tear sheets for students when they're going through a Title IX action, but we really don't touch upon broader issues. So in a very broad way, maybe talk about what type of injuries that should be on the radar of parents is something that could lead to a civil suit and what should be done.
And when you say parents of children, are you talking about college age kids or younger kids or?
I would say in general, I don't think it should be limited.
I agree.
No, I agree. I think, well, let's say first and foremost, like I am amazed, I'm sure you are too, with how many cases that we get where there is some sort of yellow flag, red flag leading up to some sort of abuse or assault that occurs. And I say that because I think when you're talking about younger children and what to kind of look for, I've seen it manifested in a lot of different ways, but you see significant behavioral changes in a child. I will say, like, from a physical standpoint, I think the large majority of cases that we get, there is no physical evidence of the assault. When I say physical, I mean on the body itself. There are sometimes, but I'd say the large majority of times there is not that physical aspect. But I always think and I know how difficult this is, obviously from personal experience and otherwise, to report when something happens. And whether that means reporting it to law enforcement, reporting it to a school, reporting it to the people that are in the know with regards to taking action, I think it's super important that be the first step. I mean, you guys have kids, so I preach to my children all the time that no matter what it is, like if you come to me and you tell me that something happened, like it's a safe place. Like we're not going to be angry at you. We're not going to be upset. We're just going to try to help and go from there. And I'm super open with them about sexual abuse, about sexual assault and consent and pornography and things like that, because I want them to feel safe with coming to me to talk about those really difficult issues. And I think that also needs, from a school standpoint, institutional standpoint, we're kind of hesitant to talk about those types of issues. But I think the more transparency there is at the end of the day, and the more that students and children know that they are safe if they do come forward about something and that they'll be taken care of and protected, the better. But I always say, like, the first thing that they should do is at least report it. Now, we have gotten unfortunately, and I'd love to hear what your perspective is on this, from a law enforcement standpoint, we've had a ton of cases over the past couple of years where we are really seeing a trend against unless there is some corroborating evidence, they are not really pushing the envelope or arresting or whatever it may be. And that's disheartening for me because I'm former law enforcement as a former prosecutor. And I see cases now where it would be a no-brainer for me to at least put it in front of a grand jury and let them decide as to whether there are going to be charges. But most of the time, I say, look at something and I say, of course I would charge on this case. And we're seeing more recently, like a, sort of trend where that's not happening for some. Have you guys seen that? What's been your experience?
Well, I want to rail a couple things back before I address that.
Sure.
I think have to set a mindset up in your home that it's okay for your kids to challenge authority, respectfully, might I add, without fearing retaliation. My daughter is a junior, and I just literally had a situation this week where she had applied to a summer program, and her teacher was supposed to get in a letter of recommendation. It didn't get in early. My daughter got the email from the institution, we still don't have your letter of recommendation. And my daughter told me early on to intervene. And then we had a conversation later in the day. And she said to me, Mom, a lot of students wouldn't have gone to their parents to intervene because they'd be really scared. What if I make Ms. X, Mr. Y mad at me? And I've really ingrained in my students that I represent and in my own home, don't worry about retaliation. Let's get an issue out early and to build that muscle on things that are not as serious, something that can be fixed. The letter of recommendation suddenly got gone. Or my older daughter, who's now starting graduate school, I will never forget this. It was sixth grade. We got her report card and we noticed that the grades were in error. Again, came to me early. We asked the teacher in that grade to recalculate it. And lo and behold, my daughter did earn an A. But that sets the stage for later reporting on the big issues. No one just comes home and says, God forbid this person in a position of authority did X to me. You've got to create a culture of telling, not tattling. And then I'll let Kristina add on about what she's been seeing with reporting with law enforcement, her perspective.
Well, I just want to say to first address your point, Susan, and it seems to me that some of these smaller matters can help empower students of all ages to feel like they can speak up when something bad happens, something that they don't want to happen, and also perhaps and ideally be more aware of negative situations and immediately remove themselves and not feel like, oh, this person is in, this is my teacher, my principal, priest, whomever has control over me. And I can't say, no, that's not okay, and remove myself from the situation. With respect to the issue of law enforcement, I think, Brian, the point you raise is an interesting one, because I wonder how much of it really is just tied to geography and the different perspectives.
Because we're not seeing that.
Yeah, the different perspectives of the district attorneys and prosecutors and their offices. Because I would say in Ohio, I don't think many criminal defense attorneys would say sexual assault cases are down. So I don't know. That's interesting. I'd be curious to hear more from others. And also, I think that just across the board with respect to college students, what we see is a greater awareness of self-advocacy in general.
And we know Title IX cases are up. If it's anecdotal, we're getting calls every day for help. And what's more interesting on the call is we're getting calls from more females wanting us to help shepherd them through as a complainant. We're getting more single-sex couples. We're getting more diversity in cases that we never saw initially.
I think that's right. And actually, that's one of the things I love about what we do is that there's always different issues that students come to us with that we help them fight for.
So we're not seeing what you see, but we love your perspective and you're part of the woods.
Yeah. Let me speak just on when you're talking about the culture aspect of things, you both talked about it. I don't know if you're seeing this in the especially school cases. Like we just filed a case in New Jersey where it was so set up for just rampant boundary crossings between students and teachers. And it really is, for me, it's like, I truly believe, I truly believe that you can prevent sexual abuse, sexual assault in the institutional setting if you have the appropriate safeguards set up and everybody is doing what they're supposed to be doing.
I do too.
I agree.
To prevent that from occurring. And where you see this happening is one of those two things are lacking or both are lacking, but it's always a cultural sort of issue in terms of the institution itself. And what I have seen is it's just set up. If it does happen, it's set up for failure. In this case that just filed over in New Jersey, teachers were texting students, and there's just a lot of boundary issues and that
It's
were
so funny you say that.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but I recently
No, go ahead.
had a conversation with someone, and basically at the heart of the story was a miscommunication that occurred between a teacher and a student, and it was over text. And it was a high schooler, and I was shocked. I'm like, a teacher should not be texting a student ever, and particularly not in high school. I mean, that's just a recipe for disaster. And it's interesting to hear you have that observation in the suit you recently filed.
Boundaries.
We talk about boundaries a lot.
Every day of our life, we talk, teach, preach about boundaries. Let's shift to fraternities, sororities, and hazing.
Haha.
Oh my gosh. We are still defending students of hazing allegations. Sometimes they have a lot of teeth to them. Other times I'm like, stop, come on.
Yeah.
I don't think popping a bottle of champagne and spilling it all over the place after kids get their big brothers is hazing. I think it's a celebration. Some acts are hazing. What are you seeing on your front?
So hazing goes so far beyond just the fraternity sorority level. Like we get a lot of these high school cases or even grade school, but high school sports cases.
We see those too.
Yeah,
and actually, we think they're worse than the college cases.
In some ways,
100%. I think they are as well. And like most of the high school cases that we've got with athletic teams has been like sexualized in nature.
Yes.
We've had Yes. Yeah. And I mean, it's straight up abuse. Like, no doubt about it. It's sexual abuse.
No doubt about it.
We've also had some cases like with military academies and things like that where similar stuff goes on. But it always comes back to like, it's the culture because it's been allowed to happen over and over again for years and years. But I think like we talked about boundaries, it is difficult to say what would be allowed and what should not be allowed. Because it is kind of a slippery slope. Once you allow certain types of quote unquote hazing to occur, even if it's somewhat innocent, people may feel more comfortable doing it, more serious hazing if they know that they can get away with it in the long run. I mean, we've seen everything, the Penn State, like death cases and things like that. Like we had my alma mater, we had a fraternity where somebody had died as a result of alcohol hazing and things of that nature.
Those are just the worst.
I know they are. I mean, because it's so easy for it to happen. I mean, I was in a fraternity at the University of Delaware as well. It is so easy for something like that to just get out of control and happen. But I want to say where we have seen the majority of our fraternity cases are more sexual assault cases than they have been hazing. We have seen a huge amount of the hazing cases in these high school athletic programs and things of that nature. And that's not to say that they're not happening at the fraternities, because they definitely still are. I just think that's something that, and for whatever reason, we've seen a little bit of a downtick in that regard, but an uptick in the sexual assaults involving fraternities, but an uptick when it comes to the hazing stuff at high schools. What are you guys seeing?
Well, something that we are seeing with greater frequency on the hazing front is, I think traditionally when people hear hazing, they think fraternities, and that's by and large what we've talked about here. But we've handled a growing number of hazing matters involving female sports teams. And so I think that, I'm curious what your experience has been in terms of hazing sort of being construed as only male students do it, because that doesn't necessarily square with some of the cases that we've been contacted about.
And actually, we're seeing a different twist going on in student organizations. We're not seeing a lot of traditional hazing. I actually agree with you. I think fraternities and sororities are getting very good at watching and monitoring alcohol abuse or use for underage students, and really trying very hard to create a collegial atmosphere that does not demean. So hopefully, we still have those cases, but they're getting less and less. What we are seeing is something totally different. We're seeing that the minute a student has a whiff of being accused of sexual assault, before there's any investigation of all, they're canceled and kicked out. That organizations are so scared of getting involved, it's like the person has leprosy. And we're seeing these students get canceled and excluded. And you talk about depression and emotional distress. Oh, we've represented students saying, I have no idea who I harmed. I have no idea what it's about. I've just been kicked out.
Just calling me names and I don't know what's driving it whatsoever, and being removed from organization after organization. That's a good point, Susan, because we are dealing with a lot of that right now. Brian, legally, if you were, for example, counsel advising one of these organizations, do you have any thoughts on why these organizations the students are taking those actions? Do you think the students are receiving advice from a national higher ups on, okay, this is too risky, we don't want to have liability for anything, just put them on leave?
I think that's a great question, Kristina. Thanks for posing it.
Yeah, I think so. I would imagine that there's somebody advising them that, we can't, just based on the allegation alone, we can't have anything to do with this person and put them on leave, do whatever you're going to do. Because the flip side is, so I'm a plaintiff's lawyer. I have a client that comes in and says, I was sexually assaulted at this fraternity party by this guy. And I find out that she reported it. There's an investigation and the fraternity didn't take any action whatsoever against this person. I'm coming in from a legal standpoint and saying, look, they may not be vicariously liable, let's say, for his actions. There is a legal theory out there called ratification that if you are put on notice of action that you didn't approve of originally, but then you ratify it by not taking any corrective action, then you can be legally responsible for all of those acts that occur. And if I'm advising those institutions, I'm probably telling them that to say, if you don't take any sort of action, then we can be responsible for everything that person did, even if we didn't have notice of it, even if we didn't have notice that this guy may be a bad guy. But I do think that institutions are petrified when anything like that, and anything of a sexual nature comes up, that they're just trying to take some sort of action that if it does turn into something down the road, that they can legitimately say, what else did you want us to do other than what we did in this case? I'm super curious to hear what your guys' perspective is on this. Like, how many of those cases that are coming in where you have the individual that doesn't really know like what happened are alcohol related?
We have a couple and there's no alcohol.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
Really?
Fewer than you might.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I fewer than you would think. We have a few right now that are quite serious in terms of what our fallout that our client has endured, and we don't know where the allegation came from. There's nothing that anyone is aware of in terms of substance abuse, whether drugs or alcohol. And the student, as Susan, used the phrase earlier, has essentially been canceled, and they're not allowed to attend any activities. They're not welcome at parties. It's a tough space to be in.
Yeah, it's a tough time. I want to nerd out on the legal question. A lot of lawyers will say, I know it's really sad you've been the victim of a crime, and there might have even been a charge or some incarceration, but if you're a victim of a crime, wow, there's going to be no insurance coverage. You shouldn't do. Do you agree with that?
No, because first and foremost, even cases involving an individual perpetrator, or an alleged individual perpetrator. So let's say, student A is alleged to have sexually assaulted student B. And let's just leave out any of the institutional aspect of things. That if that is, and I don't know what Ohio's law is on this, if there is alcohol involved in that, such that it may be an issue of mistaken consent or something along those lines, the student A says, we were drinking, she didn't tell me no, or something along those lines. We are getting insurance in those cases because it negates the intentional aspect of it, at least from an insurance standpoint. And then you talk about the cases involving the institution. So let's say that same scenario happened at a fraternity, and the fraternity had served alcohol to student B, which led to her being incapacitated, and then this sexual assault occurred. Or the fraternity knew student A was a bad guy or something along those lines. There's going to be insurance coverage there for that scenario as well, unless there's some very specific clause in the insurance contract that says, we will not provide any insurance coverage for, let's say, sexual assault that occurs under your roof. Again, like, this is what we do for a living. I mean, we have 9 of us here that solely handle sexual assault and abuse cases. And I don't know, maybe save for a handful, there's almost always been insurance coverage available in those cases. And even in cases involving college students who, for purposes of insurance, technically are dependents and insureds under their parents' policy still, they will be covered by their homeowners. Now, if there may be something in the homeowners that says we're not covering like criminal acts or something like that, but we have had college assault cases where we have sued the individual perpetrator and gotten coverage under the parents' homeowners.
That's great for the parents if God forbid, your kid's involved. Don't just give up if one person that you talk to says, forget it. There's always a way with some creative lawyering. I like that message of hope.
And on that note, we've covered a lot of ground and territory in our discussion today. We've sort of weaved in and out of broader topics and more technical legal discussion. I'd like to end by giving you the opportunity, Brian. What message or advice or words of encouragement do you have for sexual abuse survivors and their parents?
So first and foremost, I think, thank you for you guys doing what you do. I think that for survivors, it's super important to make sure that if something does happen, that you find attorneys that have experience in handling these cases that will provide you a safe place to say what you need to say and will be an integral part in your healing process. And I do believe that what we do in terms of helping people in the civil process is a crucial, important part of the healing process. I mean, you have the criminal case that deals with criminal perpetrator, but as we know, most times the abuse or assault happened because of some institutional safety failure. And really the way to prevent that from happening again is through these civil lawsuits and holding these other folks accountable as well, and giving a voice to the victim who has their own attorney in the civil lawsuit to tell their story the way that they want it to be told. So I think that's important for survivors, that they make sure when they're looking for somebody to help them in a civil case, that they find attorneys that have experience and that do these cases for the right reasons and will treat the person the way that they should be treated. I think from my perspective, and I can only speak from sort of an attorney, male attorney, but also male abuse survivor, and this is something I preach to every group that I speak to, it is super important for any of the men in your life to ensure that they feel it's okay to be vulnerable and talk about what's going on with them. I really, truly believe that if the majority of the male view out there was different than that toxic male, you got to win, you got to fight, you got to do all this stuff, don't talk about your feelings, yada, 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 but was more, hey, it's okay to talk about what's going on with you. It's okay to talk about something bad that happened to you. And let's talk it, put it on the table. It's going to be safe, well received, and things of that nature. Like, you would see a dramatic decrease in violence, in crime, and just a ton of different issues that we have with men. I mean, I've worked with sexual predators, men that have committed sexually violent acts. I've worked with survivors of sexual abuse. And I've worked with guys that have sexual addiction, things of that nature. And like, the one common theme is they all have this internal pain that they're dealing with, and they've never been able to say it felt like it was okay to talk about it. Instead, they act out in some sort of way in whatever that matter is. And I just think that if we were to really preach to the men in our life that it's okay to talk about what's going on with you, be your true, authentic self, then you would see a much better world out there. And I'm not saying that would not be the case for women as well. I can only speak to that from my perspective as sort of a male advocate and survivor.
And we needed that perspective on Real Talk. And I know, thank you for being on here. And I cannot wait for the next opportunity to pair up with you and your wonderful team, because it just makes practicing law so much more enjoyable when you get to work with such brilliant attorneys that you don't normally get to be with. Other than you, Kristina, every day of
all day,
every day, more than her own family.
Got to clarify.
Thanks for joining us, Brian. This was a real treat.
Thank you both for having me. I really appreciate it. It was great.
Thanks for listening to Real Talk with Susan and Kristina. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. And leave us a review so other people can find the content we share here. You can follow us on Instagram. Just search our handle @StoneSupler. And for more resources, visit us online at studentdefense.kjk.com. Thank you so much for being a part of our Real Talk community. We'll see you next time.